The morning I saw Henry holding that letter, I knew his world was about to crumble. What you're about to hear will leave you speechless. This is the kind of story that makes you question everything about power, greed, and what happens when they think you're too old to fight back. Henry Peterson had been waking up at 5:30 a.m. for the past 40 years. That Tuesday started like any other. The familiar sound of his old coffee maker gurgling to life, chickens clucking in the distance, and the low moo of cattle from the far pasture. But the white envelope sitting on his kitchen table would shatter the peaceful routine he'd built over 7 decades of life. His hands trembled as he opened it. The official letterhead read Midwest Development Corporation, and what followed was dressed up in polite language that couldn't hide the threat underneath. They wanted to buy his 150-acre farm. The price seemed reasonable at first glance, but the final paragraph made Henry's blood run cold. Should you fail to accept this generous offer within 30 days, we will proceed with legal acquisition procedures. Henry read that letter 3 times. Each time, his anger grew. This land wasn't just property. It was his grandfather's legacy, his father's sweat, his wife Sarah's final resting place. Every tree, every fence post, every furrow had a story. And now some corporation thought they could just take it away? Before we continue with this incredible story of one man's fight against corporate greed, hit that subscribe button for more jaw-dropping real stories that'll make you believe in the power of standing up for what's right. When the phone rang an hour later, Henry almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end was smooth, young, and sickeningly confident. Michael Bradford introduced himself as a representative from Midwest Development, calling to discuss the exciting opportunity they'd presented. Bradford's tone was patient, but condescending, like he was explaining something simple to a child. He talked about progress, about bringing jobs to the community, about how a man Henry's age shouldn't burden himself with such a large property. That last comment hit Henry like a slap. This kid, who probably had never gotten dirt under his fingernails, was telling him he was too old to manage land he'd worked for 5 decades. Henry hung up without saying goodbye. His hands were shaking, but not from age, from rage. The next week, Henry drove his old pickup into town for coffee at Mabel's Diner on Main Street. What he learned there would change everything. He wasn't alone. 5 other local farmers had received identical letters. Same company, same threats, same 30-day deadline. But the real shock came when old Pete, who'd been serving coffee in that diner for 30 years, leaned close and whispered the truth. Midwest Development Corporation was just a front. The real power behind it was Davidson Group, owned by Richard Davidson, a man whose name carried weight in 3 counties. Davidson was the mayor's brother-in-law, a major political donor, and the kind of person who made problems disappear with a phone call. He owned construction companies, apartment complexes, and half the town council. The pieces started falling into place for Henry. This wasn't about fair market value or community development. This was about power. Davidson wanted their land for a massive shopping complex, and he was using his connections to force them out. The threat of legal acquisition probably meant eminent domain, a tool usually reserved for public good, not private profit. But here's where it gets really interesting, and you're not going to believe what Henry discovered next. Henry drove home with his mind racing. That evening, he sat in his living room, looking through old photo albums, pictures of his grandfather breaking ground on the original homestead, his father working the fields during the Depression, his wedding day with Sarah right there under the old oak tree. This wasn't just real estate. This was 4 generations of Peterson family history. But Henry Peterson hadn't survived 76 years by backing down from bullies. He'd weathered droughts, floods, economic crashes, and the heartbreak of losing Sarah 5 years ago. If Davidson thought he was dealing with some helpless old man who'd roll over and surrender, he was about to learn otherwise. The next morning, Henry started calling lawyers. The first firm politely declined, saying they were too busy with current cases. The second gave him the runaround for a week before admitting they had a conflict of interest. The third was honest enough to tell him straight. They already represented Davidson Group in other matters. That's when Henry realized just how deep this went. Davidson hadn't just targeted their farms. He'd locked up the legal representation in advance. It was a classic power play. Isolate your enemies, control their options, then squeeze until they break. But what Davidson didn't count on was Henry's stubbornness and his ability to make friends in unexpected places. At the county clerk's office, Henry spent 3 days digging through public records. What he found there would have made a grown man weep with anger. Over the past 2 years, Davidson Group had quietly bought up 18 properties around their targeted area. But here's where it gets truly infuriating. Many of those properties had been sold for far below market value after the owners faced sudden mysterious problems. One family's well had been contaminated, forcing them to move. Another had their septic system fail inspection 3 times in a row. A third faced a lawsuit over property line disputes that dragged on for months until they gave up and sold. Every single case could be traced back to officials who had connections to Davidson Group. Henry was looking at a pattern of systematic harassment and corruption that made his skin crawl. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Betty Martinez, who cleaned offices downtown, mentioned that she'd overheard something interesting while working late at City Hall. 2 officials had been discussing how to expedite the Peterson situation and making jokes about stubborn old farmers who don't know what's good for them. More importantly, she'd seen documents mentioning specific zoning changes that would be fast-tracked once the properties were acquired. The shopping complex was just phase 1. Davidson was planning a massive development that would make him millions, all on land seized from local families. Henry now had proof that this wasn't legitimate business. It was a coordinated scheme involving public officials using their power to help a private developer steal land. But he was still one old man against a machine with unlimited resources and political connections. That's when Henry decided to do something that would change everything. He drove to the local newspaper office and asked to speak with Jennifer Walsh, the young reporter who'd been writing stories about local government. Jennifer was exactly the kind of journalist Henry hoped she'd be, hungry for truth and not afraid of powerful people. When Henry laid out everything he'd discovered, Jennifer's eyes lit up. This wasn't just a story about a land grab. This was corruption at multiple levels of government. She saw Pulitzer Prize potential, and Henry saw his chance for justice. The investigation that followed would shake their small town to its foundation. Jennifer started making calls, filing records requests, and conducting interviews. She discovered that the mysterious problems plaguing other landowners weren't random at all. The well contamination had been caused by accidental runoff from a Davidson Group construction project upstream. The septic failures had been orchestrated by an inspector who was secretly on Davidson's payroll. The property line disputes had been manufactured using falsified survey records. But the real bombshell came when they found the smoking gun. Jennifer's source in the city attorney's office leaked a recording of a meeting where Davidson, the mayor, and 2 city council members discussed exactly how they were going to use eminent domain to seize the remaining properties. They talked about these families like they were obstacles to be removed, not human beings with rights and histories tied to their land. In the recording, Davidson's voice was clear as he outlined his strategy. Make their lives difficult enough that they want to sell. If that doesn't work, we'll find code violations. If that doesn't work, we'll condemn the properties for public safety. The eminent domain paperwork is already drafted. When Henry heard that recording, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Absolute, burning fury, mixed with a determination that could move mountains. And then came the moment that would change everything. The story broke on a Thursday morning. Jennifer's front page article detailed every aspect of the conspiracy, complete with documents, recordings, and testimony from affected families. The headline read, "Local developer and city officials accused of land grab scheme." By noon, the phones at City Hall were ringing nonstop. By evening, protesters had gathered outside Davidson Group headquarters. By the weekend, state investigators had opened formal inquiries into the corruption allegations. Davidson tried to fight back. Of course, his lawyers sent cease and desist letters. His political allies made statements about misguided journalism and attacks on job creation. But it was too late. The truth was out, and it was spreading faster than they could contain it. The breakthrough moment came during a packed city council meeting. 2 weeks later, Henry, who had never spoken at a public meeting in his life, stood up and walked to the microphone. The room fell silent as this weathered old farmer, wearing his best suit and holding his worn cowboy hat, looked directly at the officials who had tried to steal his land. His voice was steady and strong as he spoke. He talked about his grandfather, who had broken this land with his own hands during the Depression. He talked about his father, who had mortgaged everything to keep the farm running during the drought of the 70s. He talked about Sarah, who had raised their children in the farmhouse and was buried in the family cemetery behind the barn. Then, he looked directly at Mayor Davidson and said something that would become local legend. "You made one mistake, Mr. Davidson. You thought being old meant being weak. You thought 76 years of life meant I'd be easy to push around. But what you didn't understand is that every one of those 76 years taught me something about fighting for what's right, and I've got more fight left in me than you ever had to begin with." The applause was deafening. But Henry wasn't done. He pulled out a folder containing every document Jennifer had helped him uncover. He methodically read off the evidence of corruption, the fake contamination reports, the bribed inspectors, the falsified surveys. With each revelation, the faces of the implicated officials grew paler. But wait until you hear what happened next, because that's when the real justice began. The federal investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Davidson Group was hit with RICO charges for conspiracy and racketeering. The mayor resigned in disgrace. 2 city council members were indicted. The corrupt inspector was fired and faced criminal charges. Most importantly, for Henry and the other targeted families, the court issued an injunction preventing any further harassment or forced sales. Their land was safe. But the story doesn't end there, because Henry Peterson wasn't satisfied with just protecting his own property. With the help of Jennifer Walsh and a team of volunteer lawyers who had joined their cause, Henry filed a class action lawsuit against Davidson Group on behalf of all the families who had been forced to sell their properties under duress. The evidence was overwhelming, and the case was settled for enough money to buy back most of the stolen land and compensate families for their losses. Davidson Group collapsed under the weight of legal fees and criminal penalties. Richard Davidson, the man who thought he could steamroll anyone who stood in his way, ended up bankrupt and facing federal prison time. The shopping complex was never built. Instead, the land was turned into a community park and agricultural preserve, ensuring that future generations of families would be protected from similar schemes. 3 years later, Henry still wakes up at 5:30 a.m. He still tends his 150 acres with the same dedication he's shown for decades. But now there's something different in his step. The confidence that comes from knowing he didn't just survive an attack on his way of life, he defeated it completely. When young people in town ask him about standing up to powerful people, Henry always gives the same advice. Age isn't weakness, it's experience. And experience teaches you that bullies, whether they're 15 or 50, all back down when someone stands up to them. The old farmer had proven that sometimes the most dangerous opponent for a corrupt system isn't a young hotshot with unlimited energy. It's an old man with nothing left to lose and decades of wisdom about how to fight smart instead of just fighting hard. Henry Peterson saved not just his farm, but his entire community. And he did it by remembering something the powerful men in suits had forgotten, that in America, your worth isn't measured by your age or your bank account, but by your willingness to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. The last time I saw Henry, he was working in his garden, teaching his grandson about planting corn. The boy asked him if he was scared when all those important people were trying to take their land away. Henry just smiled and said, "Son, when you've lived through as much as I have, very few things scare you anymore. But losing your principles, that's the scariest thing of all. That's the power of experience, the strength of conviction, and the truth that age isn't about slowing down. It's about knowing exactly when and how to speed up when it matters most."